Good evening, everyone. It's good to see you this evening. We'll go ahead and get started. So why is it that when we engage in conversations with people about religion today, it seems like the vast majority of the time they're coming at it from the perspective of salvation by faith only? That's going to be one of the questions that we answer tonight as we're moving from the Middle Ages into the Reformation movement. The majority of the people that we might find ourselves talking to are coming from the perspective of one of the Reformed denominations. And therefore, I think it's helpful for us to have an understanding of where they're coming from so that we can appropriately have a conversation with them about things that they need to hear. So I thought, because it's been a couple of weeks, that we'd spend at least a few minutes with review. And after the church was established in 30 A.D., thereabouts, the church entered into a period of periodic persecution that lasted for about 300 years. It wasn't continuous persecution, but there were certain times when, persecution was part of the program of the Roman Empire against the church. And this ended around 312 A.D. with the Edict of Milan, Constantine. Of course, during this time then we have the rise of certain heresies. These heresies had to do with the relationship of the Old Testament with the New Testament and the relationship of the Godhead, the relationship particularly of Jesus with God. In response to that, then, we have a series of apologists that arose to refute those heresies. And the other thing that happened more broadly in the church is that there arose this desire to rigidly defend what constituted the boundaries of the church. They wanted to segregate. Their desire, I think, was on the right track. They wanted to segregate themselves from these influences, these heretics, teachers of false doctrine. But in doing so, they set up this rigid boundary that was defined by apostolic succession. Okay, so you had to be baptized by the right person. You had to buy into not necessarily what the Bible taught, but church tradition. And this led to also the rise of a very rigid hierarchical structure for the church, leading eventually to the papacy. Also, around the time of the Edict of Milan, when Constantine moved the seat of the Roman Empire to what would become Constantinople, Byzantium, you had this division between Rome and Constantinople that also led to a division in the church. So as we move into the Middle Ages, then, the papacy just continues to rise in power, to rival even the emperors of the empires, both the Roman and the Byzantine Empire. We have the fracture between East and West, continuing to grow, so that in 1054 A.D., we have what is referred to as the Great Schism, which led to Roman Catholicism and the Eastern Orthodox Church, which we have some Eastern Orthodox churches here in Little Rock. Of course, it was during this time also that you have the rise of these strange doctrines that we've talked about a few weeks ago. Doctrines that we see portrayed on television from time to time, doctrines that we might hear people talk about. If we find ourselves going to maybe a wedding or a funeral, we see things that would be foreign to us. And we might wonder where they came from, and so we talked about the origin of some of those things and how they came. Muhammad began his work. The idea of conversion shifted in Islam away from a spiritual type activity, and it became more of a military type activity. So that they really conquered what is today the Middle East, and it reached over into Asia Minor and up into portions of Europe as well. And this was an influence that continued for over 1,000 years until the Ottoman Empire was defeated in World War I, and those nations were divided, those peoples were divided into the nations that we have today, like Syria and Saudi Arabia and Kuwait and things like that. With Islam taking over areas such as Jerusalem, the empire, along with the church, at really the behest of the church, engaged in these wars, these holy wars, if you would, called crusades, against the primarily, we talked a little bit about this a few weeks ago, primarily against the Muslims, but there were other crusades as well, and I'll talk about one of them in just a moment. The other thing that we need to make note of during this time then is also what began with scholasticism and the origin of the great universities of Europe. So when we talk about Oxford and Cambridge, these universities began as church-sponsored institutions, and they, through the centuries have continued on to become where they are today, I should say. They follow a track that really the rest of the modern world, what became of the modern world, they began as primarily religious institutions, but as time went by, even as they were religious institutions, their focus became more on humanity rather than on God. And eventually, as we move into the modern period, we go through the Enlightenment. They become secular, the secular organizations that they are today. Coming into the Reformation movement that we talked about 2 weeks ago, with the corruption that existed in the papacy. But not just in the papacy, but in the priesthood throughout the areas where the Roman Catholic Church was found. People obviously saw that wasn't right. And they were selling the office of the bishop. They were selling indulgences to raise money to build churches and universities and hospitals throughout Europe. And so people realized that wasn't right, just on the face of it. But also during this time, because of scholasticism, people are becoming more educated. We really are seeing the rise of an educated middle class, and therefore more people had the ability to read the Bible for themselves. And they could see from the description of the New Testament church on the pages of the books of Acts and the epistles, that what the church was had very little to do with what the Roman Catholic Church was. And so this led to a couple of what we might call proto-Reformation movements. I don't have the Albigenses up there because they really flourished during a very short period of time. And interestingly enough, as I was reviewing for this week, I came across something. The word crusade actually was first applied by what the Roman Catholics did to the Albigenses. And it's historians that take the word crusade and then apply it back to the earlier wars between the Catholics and the Muslims. Peter Waldo began the movement that was called the Waldensians. These churches continue to exist today. That's why the line goes all the way up through the end of the Reformation movement. They've been subsumed into many of the various Reformed denominations that still exist in Europe today. The Lollards were started by John Wycliffe in England. He had the opinion that everybody needed to read the Bible for themselves, and so he translated the Bible made it available to people. Again, people saw that the church as it's described in the New Testament has nothing to do with the church that they saw, and the practices that they saw ongoing at that point. And so this started a movement that was referred to by the insiders in Roman Catholicism. They called them lollards, which is basically a word that referred to people as being uneducated and unrefined. John Huss established the Hussite movement that began in the mid-15th century, and that actually continued and became part of some of the European denominations at that time. But what really probably made the biggest impact, we talked as we went through this, we talked about the crisis of the Middle Ages, the Black Death, the rise of nationalism, some of those things. But probably the biggest influence that kicked off the Reformation movement was the printing press, because it made the Word of God readily available to anyone who could read it. And so that was the mid-15th century. And so Martin Luther, reading the New Testament in Latin, but reading it for himself, and especially influenced and I guess righteously indignant toward the sale of indulgences, he writes the 95 Theses that we looked at a couple of weeks ago, and he tacks them, so the story goes, he tacks them to the doors of the Wittenberg Chapel. And it starts basically like a firestorm throughout Europe. People get copies of it. They make copies of it. They send copies of it. And before long, it's everywhere. And people are reading it. And they're becoming incensed with with how the Roman Catholics have been sort of withholding the truth of the New Testament church from them. And so from that particular perspective, about 500 years ago, the fires of Reformation began in Wittenberg, Germany. And so that's pretty much where we got to last week. Now, I want to, as we continue to move through the Reformation movement, I want to characterize the spirit of the Reformation movement at as high a level as I can, so that it's something that's sort of easy to grasp a hold of. And so if we think about the practice of Roman Catholicism at the beginning of the Reformation, then we would probably say that it could be summarized by the phrase, salvation by works only. Yes?
Tim, before you move into that,
yes.
How should we understand the term Orthodox when we refer to the Eastern Orthodox or the Greek? What does that term mean, or what's it imply?
That's a great question. So the term Orthodox refers to the original, and so they claim an association. They focus on the Nicene Creed and the deliberations of the Nicene Council as being sort of where they focus their attention, the authority that they go back to. Okay. And so there have been things that have arisen in Eastern Orthodox religion since then, but really they've been more successful, certainly more successful than the Catholics at maintaining a connection with their roots. The Roman Catholics continued to progress and get these strange doctrines. Is that fair?
The root of the word there, ortho, is an orthogonal, which is a mathematical term for right thinking. So, the idea that they had the truth. Now, the Catholics would have considered themselves orthodox with a little o.
Yeah.
So with a big O, it became associated with all the churches in the East. You got the Russian Orthodox, the Greek Orthodox, the Armenian Orthodox, all of those churches that were opposed to the Roman Catholic Church in the West. So it's just a term of convenience with them. It doesn't really mean that they have the truth.
Yeah. Okay. So the literal meaning of the word is the right doctrine. But typically, when we think about something being orthodox, it's true to the origin, basically.
That group stopped at a certain point, whereas the Roman Catholic continued on in the digression away from the truth.
They certainly digressed much farther than the Orthodox, Eastern Orthodox. Yes. All right. So at the time of the beginning of the Reformation movement, if you were to ask a Roman Catholic, does your church teach salvation by works only? They would say no. Okay. But what the reformers were seeing was not what was taught, but what was practiced. And so what was practiced had all to do with, acts of penance, indulgences, participation in crusades to get a person from having to go to purgatory. Yes, purgatory when they die. So what the reformers saw was salvation by works only. So basically, the reformers go to the opposite extreme. Okay, so if the Roman Catholicism practiced salvation by works only, then what the reformers taught was salvation by faith only. Okay? Now, something else that I think helps understand the general thrust of the Reformation movement are what is referred to as the five solas, sola being Latin for only. And actually, in the days of the Reformation movement, there were only three, but over time, if you were to ask somebody today, they'd talk about a total of five solas. So it started out with sola scriptura, that is, the scriptures only. And of course, this is important because the Catholics were saying, well, church tradition is just as authoritative as the scriptures. And so the reformers came along and said, no, that's not true. It's the scriptures only. Sola fide, by faith only, okay? And then sola gratia, that is grace only. So those three things, for the most part, became the rallying cry of the Reformation movement. Now, there are exceptions. But if you're talking about the Lutherans and the Reformed churches that John Calvin was influential in, then the three solas. The ones that were added later is solus Christus, that is in Christ only, and soli Deo Gloria, to the glory of God alone. And so sometimes you'll hear people just walk through all five of those, and that is in a certain sense, the creed of the Reformation movement. Again, there are exceptions, and as we go through this week and next week, you'll see what those are. All right, let's move on into Lesson 7, and we've got 10 agenda items tonight, and we're going to get through them, okay? Looking at the clock. But there are 4 influential individuals that we're going to talk about. We're going to talk about 3 movements, 3 denominations. Well, the Anabaptists are not a denomination. We'll summarize the spread of denominationalism in the 16th century. We'll talk about a Reformation that actually takes place within the Catholic Church, and then we want to talk about some religious persecution during the Reformation. So, 4 individuals who are very influential in the Reformation movement. We begin with William Tyndale. Working in Great Britain, basically taking over the work that might have been left undone by John Wycliffe. Okay, so he came out of the Lollard tradition, but he was educated in the original languages of the Bible. And what happened was when the Ottomans, the Muslims, conquered Constantinople, all of a sudden there became available to the Western Church these manuscripts, these Greek manuscripts of the New Testament. And so all of this information became available that enabled them to go back, enabled William Tyndale to go back to the original scriptures and make his translation. So it was a more effective, it was a better translation than the one that had been done by John Wycliffe.
Do you know if was Wycliffe's based primarily on the Latin Bible?
I think it was the Latin Vulgate, yeah. I'd have to go back and check that, but I think that's the case. So Tyndale, knowing that these documents are out there, he wants to make a translation. And he goes to the Bishop of London, and he's prevented from doing it. So what does he do? He goes to Germany, and he does his work in Germany. He was not able to finish it. But if you go back and you look at his translation and what he was able to do, and you read it side by side with the 1611 King James Version, remarkable similarities. And so it's very clear that those who were involved in the 1611 translation of the King James Version were influenced by the work that had been done by Tyndale. Unfortunately, he got caught up in some of the falderah that was going on with the kings of England. This is Henry VIII. Catherine of Aragon could not bear him a son, and so he wanted to divorce Catherine and marry Anne Boleyn. Of course, then Anne Boleyn doesn't do what he wants to do, so she loses her head, and he ends up having about 6 wives, and it's a real farce, his life. But when Tyndale was in Germany, someone got wind that he was there, and they extradited him back to England, where he was strangled and then burned at the stake. So things didn't work out too well for him, but he was very influential in the progress of the Reformation in England. Moving on to Ulrich Zwingli. He was born in Switzerland, and Switzerland's going to become very important in the Reformation movement. Switzerland was, as it is now, a neutral country. And so, with the Holy Roman Empire all around, Switzerland was independent, and they were much more open to the Reformation than the Holy Roman Empire or some of the other nation states that were still practicing Catholicism. You might be familiar with the Dutch philosopher Erasmus. Zwingli was a student of Erasmus. Erasmus never came out of Catholicism, but he influenced a lot of people who did. So here's what Zwingli did, though. In his ministry, he would preach expository sermons. So he might preach Matthew 1 one week, then the next week he'd preach on Matthew 2. He'd work through the Bible that way. And all of a sudden, not only he, but the people he was preaching to realized that Roman Catholicism was not the church of the New Testament. Okay, so he preached his way through the New Testament. The excesses of the Roman Catholics became very apparent. I've already talked about some of this. So Zwingli was one of the main leaders of the early Reformation movement in Switzerland. And as we think about Luther and a comparison between Luther and Zwingli, Zwingli wanted to go much farther, much faster in reforming the Roman Catholic Church. Luther was more cautious, and he had to be because he was in the Holy Roman Empire, which was still very much influenced by the Roman Catholics. Now, it's interesting and I think important to contrast Luther and Zwingli's basic approach to scriptures. Luther's basic approach was whatever the scriptures do not forbid is allowed. So in other words, unless you can find a thou shalt not in the New Testament, then you can do it. Fair game. Okay, so just bring in all the innovations. Zwingli, on the other hand, said whatever the scriptures don't allow, that is expressly forbidden. And so, in other words, Zwingli was saying you must have a thus saith the Lord for what you do in religion. And in a couple of weeks, we're gonna talk about the Restoration movement. We're going to talk about Thomas Campbell and the Campbells, their basic approach, and others. But it was Thomas Campbell who's known for the quote, "We will speak where the Bible speaks and remain silent where the Bible is silent." And I think you can align that statement much closer to Zwingli's approach than Luther's approach. All right, so we've got Tyndale and we've got Zwingli. Any comments or questions at this point? All right, so now we have John Calvin. John Calvin was actually born in France. His father was originally thinking that he'd be a priest, but then when he realized how smart his son was, he wanted him to go to law school. And so he did end up going to law school, but he ended up being a theologian. There aren't a whole lot that's known about his conversion to Protestantism. Basically, the way he described it in his commentary on Psalms was that he was like a horse that was headed in one direction, and one day God grabbed the reins and turned him around to go in a different direction. And that's about all we know about his conversion to Protestantism. But it's interesting because you can see a little bit there, the idea of irresistible grace. So we'll talk a little bit more about that in just a moment. When things got very hot for Protestants in France, he went to Switzerland. Okay, so Zwingli was born and raised in Switzerland. Calvin went there. It was right after arriving that he published the first edition of what would become basically his magnum opus. It's called the Institutes of Religion. In 536, it was 200 pages long. About 20 years later, he published the fifth edition, and it was 1,500 pages long. So it grew. But that was basically Calvin's systematic theology. In a general way, Calvin is sort of thought of, even though his name is much more widely known, it's probably accurate to say that Calvin picked up where Zwingli left off, and were influential in the Reformed churches in Switzerland. Nonetheless, Calvin's influence went far beyond Switzerland, and many of the Reformed churches, not only in Switzerland, and we'll look at a map that shows the various areas in a few minutes. But his doctrine, well, we'll talk about John Knox in just a minute. To summarize his teaching, the 5 points of Calvinism, and you can read them there yourself. They're easy to remember by the word tulip, but John Calvin he's not the one that came up with tulip. It was actually a generation or two after him that someone looked at that and said, "Hey, that spells the word tulip." And for ever since, that's how those different doctrines have been remembered. So an associate, maybe a student of John Calvin, was John Knox. John Knox was from Scotland, but again, some of the monkey business that was going on in the British hierarchy, or in the monarchy, I should say. We'll talk a little bit more about this next week. The monarchy went from one extreme to the other. One monarch might support the Catholics, and then the next one would support the Protestants. And so this was kind of going back and forth. And when Mary Tudor became Queen of England, all of a sudden Catholicism was back in vogue. So John Knox had to leave. Where did he go? He went to Switzerland because, again, the freedom there. And it was there that he met John Calvin, came under the influence of John Calvin, and there basically adopted, Calvinism as his own theology. All right, so we're going to come back to Calvin in just a minute. Before we move on from these four individuals, does anybody have any comments or questions?
You didn't mention the one we read, the Presbyterianism. That's probably the the best known denomination that is thoroughly Calvinist.
Certainly here in the United States
In the
and
United
South.
States.
Yeah.
And interestingly, you'll probably point out when we get to the Restoration movement, the Campbells came out of Presbyterian churches.
That's right. Yep. Okay, so let's talk about three different religious groups. And really, the reason why we're looking at these three is because these are the ones that basically flourished in the early years of the Reformation movement. Obviously, the first one is Luther. Luther never intended to have a church named after him. That would not have been something that he wanted at all. But instead, what the Catholics would do is if what they termed to be a heresy arose, they would label it with the most prominent person who was responsible for teaching that heresy. And so the followers of Luther came to be known as Lutheran. Luther himself, he preferred the title evangelical, and so what they were called for a while was evangelical Lutherans, but eventually the evangelical was dropped and they strictly were going by the name Lutheran. So this map shows the area where Lutheranism flourished around the Baltic Sea, but also in the Holy Roman Empire. Now, this has Germany on the map, but really at that point, what is today Germany was the Holy Roman Empire. And the thing that's most important to know about Lutheranism is that of all of the denominations, the Lutheran theologians really embraced a modern approach to the understanding of the Scriptures, a humanist approach to the Scriptures, those kinds of things. If you're familiar with the documentary hypothesis, that came out of that school of theology. And as the centuries have passed since Lutheranism began, there have been different Lutheran denominations that have developed. Some have been more successful staying true to the teaching of Lutheran than others. But here in America, I think it's fair to say that the majority of the Lutheran denominations have basically, discarded an appreciation for the authority of the Scriptures, and really even much of an attempt to be, for lack of a better way of describing it, serious about the doctrine of the Bible. Yes.
I don't actually hear much in the concept in terms of Lutheran. I don't hear much of Lutheran church much here around, or at least where I live. I don't hear much about Lutheran church very often.
Right.
I used to hear about it maybe 10, 12, 15 years ago. I haven't heard much about that church in a long time.
Well, and something that we'll probably get to the last night of this class is talking about what's going on in the religious world today. And the reality is, in these mainline Protestant denominations, for the most part, their churches are empty. People are abandoning mainstream Protestant denominations in droves. And I'll just go ahead and let the cat out of the bag. It's because they don't know what they believe anymore. There was a period in the mid-20th century that is referred to by historians as the social gospel. When we talk about social gospel, it's a little bit different than the way historians talk about it. But the Lutherans really embraced the social gospel, social justice, things of that nature, and it really wasn't about doctrine and even an effort to practice Christianity much anymore. Yes. Yeah, that's a question from the book.
Well, I'm just thinking, I would have thought the Catholics were.
Well, so that's a good point. Historians do not refer to Catholics as a denomination. The term denomination is something that proceeds out of those churches that arose in the Reformation movement. So, and Catholics would take offense at being called a denomination.
And they wouldn't, the
Yeah.
denomination really reflects the fact that Protestantism, what we're talking about, never had just this large influence like Catholicism, Orthodox. Protestant was a whole bunch of denominations. So in history, the term denomination is used to describe all the Protestant churches. They would consider us a denomination because we're Protestant.
But we consider the Catholics denomination.
Well, we consider them unorthodox.
Yeah, right. Right. Okay. The creed of the Lutheran Church is the Augsburg Confession. In the interest of time, I'm not going to talk a whole lot about that except to put up a couple of articles from the group. Article number 1, which is about God and is basically drawn from the Nicene Creed. Okay, so you see a lot of the Reformed churches, as opposed to going back to the Bible, they go back to the Nicene Creed. And then the second article on original sin shows the influence of Calvin. I mean, Luther bought into original sin as well, but we would call that, one of the tenets of Calvinism as well. The idea that in Adam all humankind sins.
That goes back to Augustine.
And thank you. Yes, I skipped over that again when I was. I didn't talk at all about Augustine.
He says Augustine, I say
Yeah,
Father.
yeah. But Augustine was a Roman Catholic scholar, so-called early church fathers. Lived in the late 4th century, and his doctrine was very influential in the church at the time. Calvinism, or John Calvin, really derived much of his theology from Augustine, and I didn't make much of Augustine, but when we were talking about him, but I wanted to make sure that we make that connection because I think it's an important one. In terms of the chief doctrines and their scriptures, these scriptures refute them. This is just sort of basic New Testament doctrine in exposing the errors of denominationalism. All right, Presbyterianism, and Skip made this point just a moment ago. When we think about Calvinism, we think about the Presbyterians, but Calvin was not involved in the origin of the Presbyterian Church at all, except in the sense that he, taught John Knox his theology. So it was John Knox who went back to Scotland, and he basically began what would become known as the Presbyterian Church. Presbyterian, anybody, why it's called Presbyterian Church? I'm sorry? It's their form of government. Presbyters basically being a transliteration from the Greek of an elder, okay? By the way, several years ago, I went to Richard to have my eyes checked, and he said, "You have presbyopia." And I thought about that, and I said, "Old eyes?" And he said, "Yep, that's what that is. You've got old eyes." So the term elders is what we're talking about there. They were unique, they were distinctive because they had elders in their church.
Well, but they had elders. The Presbyterian form of government is episcopal.
Okay.
I mean, basically, you've got a bishop, and then you've got the priests.
The board of elders.
The board of elders under the bishops,
And bishops can be responsible for multiple congregations too. So this is not, they're not respecting congregational autonomy. Yes, I'm glad you pointed that out. Did I hear? Yes.
I guess I'm reading kind of bad. A lot of people actually noticed this, and several other people who probably talked about it a little later, they kind of walked away from it, and they realized that they kept doing this over and over again. They created another Presbyterian, then they turned around and dissolved it right afterwards.
Yeah. When we'll talk a little bit about that when we get to the Restoration movement. Yeah, the last will and testament of the Springfield Presbytery. Yeah. So because of the influence of Calvinism, obviously some of their doctrines, there you have Calvinism. They also believed in the direct operation of the Holy Spirit. That's really an important aspect of Calvinism. They are Paedo-Baptists. In other words, they practice infant baptism, and they only observe the Lord's Supper periodically, not every Lord's Day. Now, for some reason, the book introduces the Westminster Confession of Faith. The Scottish Presbyterians were influential in its development, but it's actually in the next century. So we're going to talk about that next week. This is a map of the various areas that fell under the influence of these movements. The orange is the Lutheran churches. The yellow is Roman Catholic. In the green areas is where you have the Calvinist churches, see up in Scotland there. And we're not really talking about it this week, we'll get to it next week, but the Anglican Church in England. But I think what's also interesting about this is the fact that you do see how Calvinism popped up in different places. Calvin was not necessarily the father of any particular Protestant denomination. His influence was felt far and wide in different areas. And to this day, there are a very wide variety of Protestant denominations throughout Europe. You have Reformed churches in the Calvinist tradition that are just different denominations from one place to the other. The Moravian Church, the Albanian, I think there's an Albanian Reformed Church, just several examples like that.
Well, you'll find that in this country as well. Like the
Well,
Church of
sure.
the Brethren,
Yeah.
Nazarenes, and, that's why they call it denominations.
You're right.
Protestantism just, when I was young, they used to say there were, the literature I read, there were 600 denominations. I think there might be doubled now.
Oh, the number I've heard is like 30,000.
Oh, okay.
Okay, I think it's important that we talk a little bit about the Anabaptists. This is a movement, it's not a denomination, but all over Europe at this time, there sprung up these different groups of people that had in common the fact that they understood that the appropriate candidate for baptism was a believing, penitent adult. And the reason they're called Anabaptists, that basically means to be baptized again. So you have all these people that were baptized as infants when they were Catholic or when they were Lutheran or Presbyterian. And as adults, then they become convicted of the Anabaptist way of thinking, and they're baptized again. Okay, so that's why they're called Anabaptist. Two groups in America that can be tied to the Anabaptists directly are the Mennonites and the Amish. And one other thing that's important to note, of all of the groups that we've talked about so far, the Anabaptists were probably the most successful getting back to New Testament Christianity. Some of them were more successful than others. Even the Mennonites and the Amish have brought in some Calvinist, teachings, and they were all over the map, theologically. The thing that brought them together was the baptism of adults. Want to talk a little bit about the Catholic Reformation. At this point, the Catholics realized that they're way off track. They got to do something. And so they had the Council of Trent in, for, I guess, about 20 years. It met. And they basically said, okay, we're not going to do these things anymore. We're not going to sell the office of bishop anymore. That's the term called simony. And we're not going to sell indulgences anymore. But I think that's a mistake down there on the last one where it says they reaffirmed. I don't think they reaffirmed indulgences. I think they did away with them. But they basically said, okay, so here is our doctrine moving forward, and one of the important aspects of our doctrine is that the reformers are wrong, the Protestants are bad. So this opened up a period of significant religious persecution. If you were in an area dominated by one of the Protestant religions, then the Protestants were persecuting people who weren't Protestants. If you were in one of the Catholic areas, then you were persecuted because you weren't Catholic. And the reason is that this was the case is because in most instances you had a union of church and state. And so you had the church conducting itself as if it were the state. People are violating the laws of the state. therefore they are punished in a physical way. And a lot of people were burned at the stake at this point. Let's see. All right, so these are the topics that we're going to take on. We're going to move on next week a little bit farther into the Reformation movement and a few other things that the book doesn't necessarily cover.